All right, so in the last chapter at the end I said like, okay, there is a growing understanding, awareness that if we go to people and say, hey, are you racist? That people are less and less willing to admit that, even though their behavior still shows a strong preference for in-group over out-group members. So for instance, there's a strong preference in white Americans to give jobs preferentially to white over black people. So how can we square that? And in the beginning, I think people said like, okay, maybe there's something in people that they might not be aware of, or they might not be willing to admit to themselves and others, that kind of drives these behaviors. So how, if we give them a little bit more ambiguous items, if we give them items that do not directly ask for their attitude, but somehow give them the permission to express their indirect attitude. So here, this is the idea behind the modern racism scale. So instead of asking you directly, hey, do you think that black people should have the same rights as white people? You ask them, blacks are getting a little bit too demanding in their push for equal rights. Would you agree? So here you can see that if a person who's prejudiced, but who might not like to admit it to themselves, who might not be aware of that, might say like, oh yeah, I agree, right? Because there's something in them, there's like, that have here an ambiguous item, the permission almost to himself and from others to express that. It's harder to say like, well, you can say, I'm not prejudiced. I just think like that the way the black people are trying to get equal rights, that's bad, right? So, and you can see that this works a little bit better than direct measures. So there's a modern racism scale, there's a modern sexism scale, all along the lines of kind of using somewhat ambiguous items to give people the permission to express their negative attitudes. They do a bit of a better job in predicting behavior, but not much. So it's better than directly asking people, hey, are you racist? But not by much. But at the same time, when this growing awareness of the need for new measures is coming in, we also got computers. Computers were readily available, and I think this really extended what you could do in a lab to measure attitudes. And so about 25 years ago, not about 25 years ago, 25 years ago, research on implicit measures started and then absolutely exploded, as you will see in this chapter here. So 25 years ago, Rob Fazio and his colleagues published their first paper, which we will talk about a second, where they provided a way to measure implicit attitudes. And implicit here basically means it is not by directly explicitly asking somebody, how do you feel about this attitude object, how do you feel about this person as a member of a group, but rather your performance on a task indicates your attitude. So the performance bit is the important one. An implicit measure measures an attitude via performance, okay? And then 2 years later, NOSEK, BANAJI and GREENWALD introduced the IAT, the implicit association test, which that's the one we're starting, and that's the most famous one. And I'll tell you a little bit why this is so famous, or why this test became so influential. So the influential implicit association test here by GREENWALD, BANAJI and NOSEK, published in 1997, is, I hope by now you did the test. I kind of urge you to do before. If you haven't done it yourself, then please just stop here, do the test yourself. It's really important to kind of do it once yourself and to kind of experience the test. I should have mentioned it in the beginning of this presentation. I think it's really important that it's so much easier also to understand, and you can also feel a little bit what is happening. So if you haven't done it yet, please pause here, do the implicit association test. I think if you Google project implicit IAT race, you directly get a link to it. So this is the setup. If you do that, that's what you see. You have basically two tasks. You see faces, and once in a while you have to see, or for these faces you have for the race IAT, which is the one we're talking about, you have to decide whether this is a European American or an African American face, okay? And sometimes you see words like cake or flower or something like that, and then you have to say whether the word is good or bad. And the idea between the implicit association test is that it measures the strength of the association between concepts. For instance, black people, gay people, etc., and evaluations, good or bad. So how strongly are these evaluated? So how does the IAT do it? So if you, let's say we just would look at the fictional responses of Charles Manson here I don't know if you know Charles Manson. I think it's a fun way to, if not, then please Google him. He's quite a person, serial killer, currently serving life sentence in a Californian jail, and he also now has a swastika tattoo on his forehead, so I kind of assume he's at least slightly racist in his attitude. So just hope we're not doing him a disservice, but let's just assume that Charles Manson is somewhat racist. So if he would do the IIT, what will happen? So in one condition, and these are randomly assigned to you, you are asked to evaluate with one button whether the shown face is black or white. So here Charles Manson would say, okay, this person is black, okay, and this, I'm not sure why it says patient here, and this person, and another trials they would say it's white, okay. And then in other trials he would see the word pleasure, and now he has to decide whether pleasure is good or bad, okay. So as you can see here, white and good are on one button, and black and bad are on the other button. So this is basically something where the idea behind the IIT is, if you have a strong connection between the evaluation of black and bad and white and good, then in this condition you should be really fast. You should make few errors and you should be really fast in your reaction times. And then you have to do another trial where basically the assignment is flipped. Now on the left button you have white and bad, and on the right button you have black and good. So if you're Charles Manson, then this might trouble you a little bit more. You might feel like this is incongruent trials because you have a strong evaluation between white and good and black and bad, and hence this kind of disturbs your performance and you're really slow. So the score on IIT, and if you did it, you get a score, and then it's evaluated basically if you have no preference for one group over the other, or if you're slight and moderate or strong, is basically how much is there difference between this condition and this condition. And this is what indicates your preference of one group over the other. So if you're really fast here and really slow in this condition, then you have a strong preference for white people over black people in your evaluative judgment. So this would be your implicit attitude towards black people if you were, for instance, this fella Charles Manson. Okay, so this is one way to think about it. This is one measure, this is the IIT. So with it, at the same time, actually like 2 years earlier, FAZIO suggested a different way of measuring it. And let's just do it quickly together. It's much simpler, it's much more straightforward. It's also better understood how this test works. So here you would see for about 250 milliseconds, either a stereotypical white or stereotypically black American name. So this is Leroy, it's a stereotypical African American name, and then you would see a second word, and the second word is all you have to do is to say whether flower is good or bad. So you would press here good, and then you would see other trials, and you would say, okay, here's Leroy again, and now you see reds, and reds you have to see bad. So the idea behind it is like, if Leroy automatically activates a negative evaluation, so if it becomes more accessible in your memory, then you will be faster to respond to something that also has a negative attitude. You would have some kind of response facilitation. And this is basically what they find in white subjects, right? So here you can see the black line. This is black people, picture of black people. So if a black basically a black picture is followed by a negative word, then people are relatively fast. And if it's basically, and you can see kind of like the slowdown here, if it's followed by white, they're relatively slow. And you don't see this difference kind of simplified a little bit here for white people. Okay, so this is a different way. So here you would basically see, does a white or a black face automatically activate a certain type of evaluation? And if so, we can basically use this subsequent processing to indicate whether you have like a favorable or non-favorable attitude towards that group member. Now, with that, I just want to quickly show you two other versions. There's tons of different implicit measures, right? They became super popular. So here's one. It's called. I show you the other two most popular ones. This is the so-called affective misattribution procedure by PAYNE. So here you would just say James for just 75 milliseconds, so you can clearly see it, and then you see a Chinese pictogram, okay, a Chinese or Mandarin character, and then you have to say whether you perceive this character as nice or not so nice, whether you think this character is pleasant or not. So this is, you have to quickly make a decision, and it's called misattribution because the idea is if James activates some kind of positive effect because you think he's white and you didn't have stats with him, then you might have a positive association with the name, and this colors, imbues the evaluation of this character with positive affect, and we say positive, and that's how you can measure by the performance how they respond to these Chinese characters to measure your implicit attitude. There's also the weapon identification task, also by PAYNE, who is quite active in that field. So here you basically see first a mask. This is this, and then you see a black face, and then you see either a tool or a gun. And here it's basically what you have to do is you have to decide whether you only have to decide you're told to ignore the pictures and simply say whether the tool is, or the picture is a tool or a gun. And the idea here is that often police officers would kind of shoot a black person, often, fortunately not, but sometimes when American police officers would shoot a black person, they would say like, oh, he was grabbing into his jacket and I thought he pulled out a gun, and so I shot him 75 times. Turns out it was just a wallet, or it was just something that looked like a gun. So this is what they're trying to show here, and they can see that white people in general, but also in particularly troublesome white police officers are more likely to mistaken a tool as a gun when they see a black face than a white face. So just a final word before we finish this chapter on why is the IAT so popular? Why not the other ones? Why did the IAT gain such popularity, and what did we learn? So these are the results here of more than, I think, 2 million participants that participated. Oh, it says there, more than 2 million participants who went to the project Implicit, where I sent you to, and did the race test. So the people could basically do this test for free on their own, but the researchers at Harvard would get the data and analyze the data. So millions of people, literally millions of people have done that. So you can here see basically this is the extent to which people have a bias. And so what you can see here is that men have a little bit more, but basically both men and women show a bias that indicating that they prefer or favor white over African Americans. Okay, age group, as you would expect, old people are somewhat more have a somewhat more implicit negative attitude towards black people than younger people, but you can see there's not that much variation. This is a little bit the outlier, but you can see that basically in all age groups, right, below 18, so it starts very early, and then basically everyone has a relatively moderate bias or preference in their responses, indicating they like white people more than black people. One thing I think that's always important for us to kind of realize that education doesn't make a difference, whether you only have some high school or you are like me and have a PhD, there's basically no difference in your responses. So it's not that more educated people are less biased on these tests. You can also see that political identification has somewhat an impact. You can see here political identification, and what you can see there is that strongly liberal people have the least amount, and yet they still have it, and strongly conservative people have the strongest. But right, if you can see that everyone has clearly a bias, if that's the zero. Doesn't matter. I think like Hispanic people have the same than non-Hispanic people. So this is another kind of indicator how widespread it is. And you can see here for race, right? It's basically only Black and African Americans who do not have that bias, who might have a very slow, slight preference for Black over white, but it's very minor, right? You see everyone else in the US prefers white people over Black people. And hence this is what then researchers led to claim that we all have these biases. We're not aware of them, and we talk about this in the next chapter, that everyone has it, that we're all aware, we're unaware of them, and that they don't change and they're pervasive, and we have to address that. I think one final word I just want to say before finishing that here, which I will not talk about the next one, but you have to remember that each of them, right, each of these, this is basically the average response, the mean, right? And as you know from statistic, that basically, oops, that's a terrible normal curve, let's say that, right, there are people here and there are people here all over, and this is what the mean is, right? So there are some people in all of these samples who either have no bias or have a preference on the other. They're the minority, but these people exist. So just to kind of, because I will not talk about this again, but it's clear that not everyone has these biases, but the data would depressingly suggest that most of us. So just a final word, I think, on the IIT here is to say like, okay, I think there's like two kind of, just to give you a feeling for how impactful it is. This is a quote, I think, from a BBC piece. It's in the notes here of the PowerPoint. It says, "Indeed, it is hard to think of an experiment in social psychology which had such a far-reaching impact," right? It is like the way we think about racism, the way we think about prejudice, sexism, and so forth is dominated by the results of this test. Here you can see the presidential debate, which kind of summarized that. I think in the debate 2016 between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Hillary suggested, based on the findings from the IIT, that we should admit that we all are somewhat racist. And you can see it made it to the absolute mainstream. And Donald Trump's response was like, "In our debate this week, she accused the entire country, essentially suggesting that everyone, including our police, are basically racist and prejudiced. It's a bad thing," she said. Okay, and in the next chapter, we want to see how bad is it true, is it not true, and what are the conceptions, the findings we have about the IIT and about implicit measures that hold up to scrutiny, and what are misconceptions that exist in the world.